Welcome to a journey into one of the most unsettling tales in Appalachian history. Today, we'll delve into a mystery that has remained hidden in shadow for more than a century. A story that challenges our understanding of marriage, family, and the dark secrets that can linger in the remote mountains of Virginia. Tell us where you're joining from as we investigate this case. It was 1870. The Civil War had ended just 5 years earlier, leaving deep wounds across the South. Virginia, in particular, struggled to rebuild amidst the aftermath. Life in the Appalachian Mountains followed its own rhythm, shaped by the seasons, the demanding labor of the land, and traditions that traced back to the first European settlers of those fog-laden peaks. The Appalachian region of Virginia was a world apart. Families lived on isolated homesteads, often separated by miles of thick forest and steep valleys. Roads were rudimentary, mostly paths cut through the wilderness that turned into muddy traps during heavy winter rains. Communication between communities was slow and arduous. News could take weeks to travel across the county. In this world of isolation and post-war reconstruction, Theodore Whitmore emerged, a man who would become linked with one of the most puzzling cases in the area's history. Theodore inherited a vast mountain estate from his father, who had died in the war. The property spanned hundreds of acres, covered in pristine forest, and featured a grand two-story colonial home with a wraparound porch. His nearest neighbors lived nearly 6 miles away. Solitude was part of life there, though not unusual for the era. What became alarming, however, was the pattern that began to unfold over the next few years. Theodore married for the first time in 1866, a year after returning from the war. His bride, Sarah McKinley, was the daughter of a farmer from a nearby county. The wedding was held in the local church, attended by a small gathering of relatives and friends. Sarah moved into Theodore's mountain home, and during the first months, she was occasionally seen visiting the nearest town with her husband. Gradually, these appearances became rarer. When asked about Sarah's absence, Theodore claimed that she was in delicate health and preferred to remain at home, avoiding the harsh mountain air that threatened her lungs. Then, in the winter of 1868, Theodore appeared in town dressed in somber black. "Sarah has died," he announced. A sudden illness had claimed her within days. Her remains were interred on the estate in a small family cemetery dating back to his grandfather. At the time, burying the dead on private property was common, especially in rural areas where transporting a body to town could take days. Some locals found the swift burial unusual, but no one openly questioned it. Deaths from sudden fevers, pneumonia, or tuberculosis were common in those years, and Theodore seemed genuinely grief-stricken. What shocked people next, however, was how quickly Theodore moved to remarry. Just 6 months after Sarah's death, he announced his engagement to Margaret Dawson, a 22-year-old woman from a respected family elsewhere in Appalachia. Their wedding took place in the summer of 1869, again at the local church. Margaret was known as cheerful, outgoing, and vivacious with an easy smile. Like Sarah, Margaret moved into Theodore's remote home, and like Sarah, her trips to town became progressively less frequent until she vanished entirely from public view. Theodore offered varying explanations. She was occupied with household duties, expecting a child, or caring for ill relatives visiting the estate. The excuses shifted, but the result was the same. Margaret was no longer seen. By the early 1870s, Theodore was in black again. Margaret had died in childbirth, along with the baby. She, too, was buried quickly in the family cemetery. Whispered doubts circulated quietly, but no one acted. The pattern was emerging, yet it was still too soon for anyone to piece the truth together. Theodore was wealthy, respected, and a war veteran. His stories were believable in that context. Young women often died in childbirth, and the remoteness of the estate made verifying claims difficult. It was around this time that Theodore began courting a third prospective bride. And here a curious detail started to draw attention. One that seemed trivial at first, but would ultimately be key to understanding the sinister reality behind that house lost in the Virginia mountains. The third woman to enter Theodore Whitmore's life was Elizabeth Crawford, the daughter of a successful cloth merchant who had prospered following the war. Elizabeth was 24 when she met Theodore at a church dance in the fall of 1870. He wooed her with thoughtful gifts and carefully crafted words, promising a life of comfort, far removed from the hardships of the world. The engagement was announced in November of that year. Elizabeth's family was thrilled at the prospect of her marriage. Despite the tragedies Theodore had endured, he was considered a suitable match. His wealth and social position made him an even more attractive prospect. But during the preparations for the wedding, something unusual occurred. Something Elizabeth herself later mentioned to her closest friends. On a visit to Theodore's estate to see what would become her future home, she noticed something striking. There wasn't a single mirror anywhere in the house. Not in the entryway, not in the bedrooms, and not even in the bathroom. Where mirrors would normally hang on the walls, there were only empty spaces or paintings depicting somber mountain scenes. When Elizabeth asked Theodore about the missing mirrors, he gave an explanation that seemed odd, but not entirely unreasonable for the time. He said that after the death of Margaret, his second wife, he had developed a deep superstition about mirrors. He believed that mirrors could trap the spirits of the dead, preventing them from finding peace. Out of respect for his lost wives, he had removed all the mirrors from the home and stored them in the attic. Elizabeth shared this with her friends, finding the belief peculiar but somewhat understandable for a man who had suffered such painful losses. At the time, superstitions involving mirrors were fairly common. Many households covered mirrors when someone died, following folk traditions linking mirrors to the spirit world. Theodore and Elizabeth's wedding was held in December 1870, a modest affair reflecting Theodore's recent bereavement. Elizabeth moved into the mountain house on a cold winter morning, her luggage filled with dresses and hopes for her new life. Friends visited during her first few weeks, describing the home as large but eerily quiet, with long hallways and locked doors. After that initial visit, Elizabeth vanished from social life entirely. Months went by without anyone seeing her in town. Theodore occasionally appeared to purchase supplies, always alone, always repeating the same explanation: Elizabeth was well. She simply preferred the peace of life at the farm. But this time concern grew. Elizabeth's mother, worried by the prolonged silence, decided to make an unannounced visit in the spring of 1871. The journey through muddy Appalachian roads was arduous, but her worry outweighed the difficulty. When she arrived, Theodore met her with cold politeness. He insisted that Elizabeth was resting and unwell, unable to receive visitors. Her mother pressed, but Theodore blocked her way and promised that Elizabeth would write as soon as she recovered. With little choice, Elizabeth's mother returned home without seeing her daughter. The promised letter never came. 3 weeks later, Theodore appeared at the Crawford family home, mourning for the third time. "Elizabeth has died," he declared, attributing it to a sudden lung illness. The burial has already taken place in the family cemetery, alongside Sarah and Margaret. This time, the reaction was different. Elizabeth's family was distraught and deeply suspicious. Her father, a determined man, demanded to see her grave. Theodore consented, and the Crawford family traveled to the estate. In the small cemetery, enclosed by a rusty iron fence, they found 3 simple headstones: Sarah McKinley Whitmore, Margaret Dawson Whitmore, Elizabeth Crawford Whitmore. The dates of death were unusually close together. Lives ended far too quickly. Elizabeth's father requested that her body be exhumed, but Theodore refused vehemently, claiming it would desecrate the dead and violate Christian principles. At that time, exhumations were rare, requiring strong justification and official permission. With no solid evidence of wrongdoing or witnesses, county authorities denied the request. Meanwhile, rumors spread through Appalachian communities like wildfire. 3 young wives dead in under 5 years, each buried swiftly on Theodore's remote estate. The odd detail about the mirrors mentioned by Elizabeth began to take on sinister significance. Some speculated that Theodore was hiding something, that perhaps the women were not truly dead, but imprisoned within the sprawling house. The mirrors may have been removed to prevent them from seeing their reflections, losing track of time, and eroding their sense of self. These theories were unproven, born of fear and the imagination of isolated communities where dark tales entertained long winter nights. Others offered more plausible, though still unsettling, explanations. Perhaps Theodore was a man cursed by misfortune, or perhaps he was dangerous in ways impossible to prove. Life in the mountains was harsh, and women did die young from illness, but 3 deaths in succession seemed impossible to dismiss as coincidence. What no one anticipated was that Theodore, seemingly unfazed by the rumors and growing suspicions, began courting a fourth woman just months after Elizabeth's death. Her name was Catherine Miller, only 19 years old. She was the youngest daughter of a farming family that had settled in the lower valleys of the Virginia Appalachians decades earlier. Unlike Theodore's previous wives, Catherine came from modest means. Her family worked rented land, cultivating tobacco and corn on the unforgiving soil. The opportunity to marry a wealthy man like Theodore promised a dramatic shift in fortune, not just for her, but for her entire family. Theodore met Catherine at a local fair in 1871, where she was selling preserves made by her mother. He approached politely, purchased several jars, and struck up a conversation. Over the next few weeks, he visited the Miller household multiple times, always bringing modest yet thoughtful gifts for a family of limited resources: fine fabrics, sugar, even a pair of leather boots for Catherine's father. Catherine's parents were aware of the rumors surrounding Theodore and his deceased wives, but financial need outweighed caution. Theodore offered convincing reassurances. He explained that the previous deaths had been tragic accidents, the result of fragile lives in the mountains, where doctors were scarce and illnesses could prove fatal within days. He presented death certificates signed by a traveling physician who occasionally passed through the region. On paper, everything appeared legitimate. The engagement was announced in December 1871. This time, however, the community responded differently. A group of older women, friends of the families of Theodore's former wives, decided to intervene. They visited the Millers and shared stories that went beyond the known facts. They spoke of Sarah, who had mentioned feeling constantly watched before disappearing from society. They recounted Margaret's letters to her cousin describing locked rooms in the house, with no explanation from Theodore. They mentioned Elizabeth's comments about missing mirrors and an unexplained sense of unease. Catherine listened closely, but her family was determined. Theodore had offered a generous dowry, enough for the Millers to purchase their own land. It was an opportunity they could not pass up. Catherine herself seemed captivated by Theodore in a way that concerned the older women. She admired his sophistication and education, qualities far beyond her reach. Any potential danger seemed abstract compared to the tangible reality of poverty. The wedding took place in January 1872, even more modest than previous ceremonies. Only Catherine's immediate family attended, along with the local pastor, who reluctantly officiated. On a frosty morning, Theodore drove his fourth wife to the mountain home. The carriage crawling up the uneven road, the dense fog turning the surroundings into a ghostly blur. In the first weeks after the marriage, Catherine wrote 2 letters to her mother. The first arrived 10 days after the wedding. She described the house as impressive but strange, noting again the absence of mirrors and recounting Theodore's explanation about superstitions regarding his deceased wives. She mentioned the numerous rooms, some kept locked, purportedly containing old furniture and belongings Theodore had not yet organized following his father's death. The second letter arrived 3 weeks later, with a different, more subdued tone. Catherine wrote that she was adjusting to farm life. She described Theodore as attentive but reserved, guiding her in managing the household. She noted specific rules he had set for the property. There were areas of the surrounding woods where she was not to walk alone, an old barn at the rear of the estate deemed unsafe, and the attic which remained locked because the floorboards were unstable. After this second letter, silence. Weeks became months without any news from Catherine. Her mother, Martha Miller, sent letters to the estate but received no replies. When she finally arranged a visit in April 1872, she was met with the same icy reception Elizabeth's mother had encountered. Theodore met her on the porch and refused entry. He claimed Catherine was struggling to adjust emotionally and had requested no visitors until she felt more stable. Martha pleaded, argued, and even wept, but Theodore remained resolute, promising that Catherine would write when she was ready. Martha Miller returned home burdened with a heavy heart and an unnameable sense of dread. She confided in her husband, who suggested contacting the county sheriff. But what could they report? Theodore had refused a visit, and Catherine was not responding to letters, hardly a crime. Theodore was influential, a war veteran, and a landowner. The words of a poor farming family carried little weight against him. It was then that Martha made a bold decision. She reached out to the other women in the community who had previously tried to warn. Before the wedding, Catherine, and the women from the community devised a plan. They decided to take an unusual step for the time, collect every piece of information they could about Theodore and his previous wives. They documented the strange patterns, the unsettling coincidences, and presented their findings not only to the local sheriff, but also to a county judge known for his strict fairness. It took weeks to compile everything. They spoke with merchants who supplied Theodore and noticed he consistently purchased provisions in amounts that seemed far too small for 2 people. They interviewed the traveling doctor who had signed the death certificates for the first 3 wives, discovering he had never actually examined the bodies, merely relying on Theodore's account of their symptoms. They spoke with the pastor who had officiated the weddings, who admitted to feeling a growing unease but was unsure how to act. For 1872, what these women were doing was extraordinary. At a time when women had few legal rights and little influence over official matters, they were conducting a parallel investigation, guided by an instinct that something was profoundly wrong in the isolated mountain home. In June of 1872, they finally secured a hearing with Judge Harrison Blackwood, a 60-year-old man renowned for his integrity and unwavering authority. They presented all they had uncovered: the pattern of deaths, inconsistencies in the stories, the isolation of the wives, the removed mirrors, the locked rooms, and Catherine's silence. Judge Blackwood listened intently. A veteran of many years in the Virginia judicial system, he found the story before him disturbing and unusual. There was no direct proof of foul play, only a convergence of circumstances painting a troubling picture. He requested time to review the death certificates the women had managed to obtain copies of. All 3 certificates bore the signature of the same itinerant physician, Dr. Jonas Peyton, who roamed the mountain counties offering services where proper doctors were scarce. The causes of death listed were generic fever for Sarah, complications in childbirth for Margaret, pneumonia for Elizabeth. Nothing that would raise immediate suspicion in an era when such ailments were common and often fatal. But Blackwood noticed something the women hadn't. The dates on the certificates revealed a peculiar pattern. Each wife had died between the 6th and 8th month of marriage. Not during the initial adjustment period, not years later, but in a remarkably consistent time frame, as if following a predetermined schedule. The judge decreed that a formal investigation was necessary. He summoned the county sheriff, Robert Hutchkins, a man who had served alongside Theodore during the war and had a relationship of mutual respect. Hutchkins was initially hesitant to investigate a fellow veteran based on what he called woman's gossip, but Blackwood insisted. In July 1872, Sheriff Hutchkins and 2 deputies traveled to Theodore's mountain estate. They arrived at noon under a blazing sun, the heat shimmering across the landscape. Theodore's house loomed before them, white paint peeling, windows shuttered even in the warm weather. Theodore greeted them on the porch with his usual courtesy, but his posture and voice betrayed tension. When Hutchkins explained that they were there to check on Catherine and ensure her well-being, Theodore attempted the same approach he had used with the visiting mothers. He claimed Catherine was unwell and could not receive visitors. Hutchkins, however, was no desperate parent without legal authority. Armed with Judge Blackwood's order, he had the power to enter. Theodore realized resistance was futile and reluctantly allowed them inside. The interior was darker than expected for a summer day. Curtains were drawn in nearly every room, casting a perpetual gloom. The air was still and heavy with an indistinct odor, a mix of mildew, dried herbs, and something else neither man could identify. Hutchkins immediately noticed the absence of mirrors, confirming the women's reports. Theodore led them through the house, the living room, the library filled with dusty books, the kitchen where a single pot sat on the wood stove. Everything was tidy, but the rooms felt abandoned, maintained only to give the appearance of use. When Hutchkins asked about Catherine, Theodore hesitated, as if calculating his response. Finally, he said she was resting upstairs, not feeling well for several days. The men ascended the wooden stairs which creaked underfoot. The upstairs hallway had 5 doors, 3 of them closed. Theodore led them to the back room and knocked softly, announcing visitors. A long silence followed. Then a faint female voice replied that she did not wish to see anyone. Hutchkins persisted, identifying himself as the sheriff and stating he only needed to ensure her safety. More silence. Finally, the voice relented, allowing them in. The room was darker than the rest of the house. A single candle burned beside the bed, where a figure lay under heavy blankets despite the summer heat. Hutchkins approached and saw Catherine. Catherine appeared pale and far thinner than her family had expected, with deep shadows under her eyes and hair strewn messily across the pillow. The sheriff asked about her condition, whether she needed medical attention, if she was being properly cared for. Catherine glanced at Theodore, who lingered in the doorway, and spoke in a flat, monotone voice. She claimed she was simply tired, that Theodore was looking after her well, and that she needed nothing. But her eyes told a different story, an unsettling mix of fear and resignation that made Hutchkins uneasy. One of the deputies, younger and less experienced, asked bluntly why she hadn't written to her mother or allowed visits from her family. Catherine opened her mouth to respond, but Theodore gently intervened, explaining that she was going through a period of melancholy, something that sometimes afflicted young women, and that her doctor had advised rest and seclusion. Hutchkins remained unconvinced, but there was no legal grounds to act further. Catherine was alive in her own home, the lawful wife of Theodore, and while she appeared unwell, there were no outward signs of violence or confinement. Hutchkins suggested she send a message to her family. After another glance at Theodore, Catherine agreed to write a letter soon. Before leaving, the sheriff requested to inspect the rest of the house, including the locked rooms mentioned in the reports. Theodore tensed but ultimately complied. He explained that 2 rooms contained only covered furniture and boxes of family belongings, while the third was his private office with important papers and some antique weapons. He unlocked the doors one by one. The first 2 rooms matched his description: antique furniture under dust, covered sheets, boxes stacked high, showing no sign of recent use. The office held a desk, shelves of ledgers, and mounted weapons. Nothing appeared suspicious at first glance. Hutchkins then asked about the attic. Theodore insisted it contained only old trunks and warned that the floorboards were unstable. The sheriff pressed to see it regardless. Theodore hesitated, an unreadable expression crossing his face, but eventually agreed on the condition that only one person ascend at a time, and that he would accompany them to indicate unsafe boards. The attic entrance was at the end of the second-floor hallway, accessed by a retractable wooden ladder that creaked ominously when lowered. The opening exhaled air heavier than the rest of the house, the strange scent lingering and intensifying. Hutchkins took the climb himself, leaving the deputies and Theodore below. The ascent was difficult. He had to stoop under the low ceiling formed by the sloping roof. Theodore followed with an oil lamp, casting shifting shadows on the exposed beams. The attic stretched the full length of the house, long and narrow, divided by the roof supports. Near the entrance, old trunks were stacked high, draped in cobwebs. Hutchkins saw old clothing, crockery wrapped in cloth, the typical accumulations of a long-occupied household. Theodore pointed out weakened floorboards, holes revealing the darkness below. As Hutchkins moved deeper, his heart began to race. Against the far wall, partially obscured by a dark cloth, were mirrors, not 1 or 2, but a dozen or more, varying from small hand mirrors to full-length ornate frames. Some faced the wall, others partially covered, a few catching the dim light of Theodore's lamp at odd angles. Hutchkins approached cautiously, questioning Theodore about the mirrors. Theodore repeated his story about superstition and respect for the dead, but the sheriff noticed subtle signs: how Theodore positioned himself between Hutchkins and the mirrors, the way he held the lamp, that raised his suspicions. Then Hutchkins saw something else. Behind the larger mirrors were chests unlike those near the entrance. Smaller, more ornate, the kind used to store personal valuables. Hutchkins asked to inspect them. Theodore quickly insisted they contained only jewelry and documents of his deceased wives, kept for respect but never opened. The sheriff pressed further. Theodore, now visibly anxious, claimed he didn't have the keys, which were kept in his office. Hutchkins doubted the story, but realized he was overstepping his authority. Judge Blackwood's order authorized a welfare check on Catherine, not a full property search for unspecified crimes. Hutchkins decided he needed additional authority before investigating further. He descended the attic ladder with Theodore close behind. The group left the house under the bright afternoon sun, and Hutchkins noticed Theodore seemed almost relieved. Before departing entirely, the sheriff asked one last question: to see the private cemetery, where Theodore's first 3 wives were buried. Theodore led them down a winding path. They followed the path through the property to a small plot enclosed by a rusted iron fence. The 3 headstones were as the Crawford family had described, simple grey marble engraved with names and dates. Sarah McKinley Whitmore, 1846–1868. Margaret Dawson Whitmore, 1847–1869. Elizabeth Crawford Whitmore, 1846–1871. Hutchkins examined the soil around the graves. The earth appeared recently disturbed, consistent with a burial, but there was nothing overtly suspicious. He asked Theodore if he would allow exhumation should the judge order it. Theodore went pale and responded vehemently that he would not, claiming it would desecrate the dead and that he would fight such an order through every legal means. The ride back to town was silent and tense. Hutchkins sensed something deeply wrong at the house. He could feel it in his bones, yet there was no concrete evidence of a crime. Catherine was alive, albeit clearly unwell. The house was strange, but strangeness was not illegal. The mirrors stored in the attic were unusual, but Theodore had offered an explanation. Bizarre, yet plausible within the beliefs of the time. When Hutchkins reported his findings to Judge Blackwood, the judge became contemplative. He summoned Dr. Jonas Pitton, the itinerant physician who had signed the death certificates. A week later, Pitton arrived, a wary, middle-aged man in worn clothing. Under questioning, he admitted something that shifted the investigation dramatically. Pitton confessed that he had never examined the bodies of Sarah, Margaret, or Elizabeth. Theodore had contacted him each time, describing the symptoms and progression of illness, and requested the death certificates to avoid bureaucratic procedures with the county. Pitton, always short on funds and trusting the word of a respected war veteran, had signed the documents based solely on Theodore's account. He now recognized this as a grave error, a violation of medical standards, though at the time it had seemed like a harmless favor to a grieving man. This revelation was critical. There was no verified medical proof that the 3 women had died from the causes listed. In fact, there was no independent confirmation they were truly dead. As unlikely as it seemed, it raised the question, if the women weren't dead, where were they? Hidden somewhere on the property, sold? Imprisoned? Judge Blackwood issued a more comprehensive order, authorizing a full search of Theodore Whitmore's estate, including the exhumation of the 3 graves. The operation was scheduled for 2 weeks later to allow time to gather personnel and resources. But Theodore never allowed the search to occur. 3 days before the scheduled inspection, on a foggy August morning in 1872, smoke was seen rising from the mountains surrounding his property. When Sheriff Hutchkins and a group of men arrived hours later, they found Theodore's house engulfed in flames, already consuming much of the structure. Local volunteer firefighters attempted to intervene, but the house's isolation and limited water made the effort futile. They could only watch as decades of history and hidden secrets were reduced to ash and smoldering debris. The wooden building burned with unusual intensity, as though prepared for destruction. By dusk, only the skeletal remains stood, charred beams pointing skyward like accusatory fingers. The fire had been so intense that even the foundation stones were cracked and blackened. The pungent smell of burning wood mixed with the descending mountain mist, creating an eerie atmosphere that sent shivers down the spines of several men present. Questions swirled in everyone's minds: where was Theodore? And where was Catherine? Hutchkins immediately organized a search of the surrounding area. Men with torches scoured the nearby woods, calling names, looking for signs of life or escape. But the Appalachian terrain was vast, rugged, and full of places to hide. Nightfall made the search nearly impossible. At dawn, with light sufficient for a proper investigation, Hutchkins returned with a larger team. They began examining the still smoldering ruins. The work was dangerous, with unstable beams threatening to collapse and pockets of residual heat still radiating from the ashes. Using shovels and hooks, they carefully sifted through the wreckage, searching for human remains that might indicate Theodore and Catherine had perished in the fire. The task took days. The house, once a 2-story home with an attic, was now a compacted heap of charred wood, destroyed furniture, and unrecognizable melted objects. They found remnants of an iron stove, twisted nails, shards of crockery, metal parts of books whose pages had been reduced to ash, but no bodies. The absence of remains suggested 2 possibilities. Either Theodore and Catherine had escaped before the fire fully consumed the house, or the fire had been so intense that nothing recognizable survived. The latter possibility seemed improbable, since even the hottest fires often leave behind bones or teeth, yet it could not be entirely ruled out. Hutchkins then turned his attention to the private cemetery. The 3 headstones had survived, untouched by the blaze that had destroyed the main house. Judge Blackwood's exhumation order remained active, now carrying added urgency. If the women were truly buried there, examining their remains could reveal the actual causes of death. If the graves were empty, it would confirm even darker suspicions about Theodore's actions. The exhumation began on the afternoon of the 3rd day following the fire. The work was solemn and unsettling. Men with shovels carefully dug the grave of Sarah McKinley Whitmore, Theodore's first wife. The depth seemed typical for the time, around 6 feet. But when they reached what should have been the coffin, they discovered something completely unexpected. There was no coffin. Instead, a crude wooden box, the type normally used for tools or supplies, had been buried. Inside, rather than a body, there were stones, roughly the size and weight of a human, wrapped in rotted cloth. A stunned silence fell over the men. The implications were clear and horrifying. The grave was a sham. Sarah McKinley Whitmore had never been buried there. So where was she? What had Theodore done to her? With growing urgency, the team moved on to the second grave, that of Margaret Dawson Whitmore. Their anxiety made their movements faster, less careful, and they found the same thing, a crude box filled with stones wrapped in cloth. Another false grave, another missing wife. The third grave, Elizabeth Crawford Whitmore's, revealed the same grim pattern, stones in place of a body. 3 women, reportedly dead and buried on the estate, were gone. 3 families who had mourned over these markers had been cruelly deceived. The discovery of these sham graves transformed the investigation from suspicious deaths into something far more sinister. It was no longer just a matter of determining if Theodore had killed his wives, but rather uncovering what had become of them. If they were not dead and buried, where were they? Still alive somewhere, kidnapped, hidden, or otherwise disposed of. Judge Blackwood issued an arrest warrant for Theodore Whitmore for fraud, falsification of death certificates, and suspicion of abduction. But Theodore had vanished. An extensive manhunt was launched, involving local authorities and deputies from neighboring counties. Posters circulated widely across the Appalachian region of Virginia and nearby states, describing him as a man of roughly 45, average height, dark hair streaked with gray-brown eyes, erect military posture, well-dressed, polite in speech, and possibly accompanied by a young woman named Catherine, blonde and fragile, considered highly dangerous. As investigators pursued Theodore, they began examining records to learn more about his past. What they discovered was chilling. Theodore Whitmore was not who he claimed to be. The real Theodore Whitmore, the son of the original mountain farm owner, had died during the Civil War in 1863 in a battle in Pennsylvania. Military records confirmed his death. So who had been living in the house for nearly a decade, marrying women who then vanished? How had he assumed the identity of a dead man and remained undetected for so long? In the chaos of post-war Virginia, with destroyed records and displaced populations, assuming a new identity was not impossible, especially in remote areas where few had known the original Theodore. Investigators scoured the charred remains of the house for any documents that might reveal the impostor's real identity. But the fire had been thorough, destroying nearly every piece of evidence. The few surviving fragments were illegible. News of the false grave spread across the mountains like a cold winter wind. Families who had known the missing wives were devastated. Sarah McKinley's mother, already elderly, fell gravely ill upon learning she had been visiting an empty grave for years. Elizabeth Crawford's father, still mourning, now faced the agony of not knowing if his daughter was alive, and if she was, what horrors she had endured. Martha Miller, Catherine's mother, was the most vocal in her grief and anger. She organized meetings with the other families, forming an informal committee determined to uncover the truth. These women and men began a parallel investigation, interviewing anyone who had contact with the false Theodore, collecting every scrap of information that might reveal who he really was and what he had done to their daughters. It was through these efforts that the first significant clue emerged. A draper from a neighboring county recalled selling Theodore large quantities of black cloth over the years, not for clothing or curtains, but entire rolls of It was heavy fabric, the sort used to completely cover windows or line walls. The amounts were enormous, far exceeding what would be needed for ordinary household purposes. Another merchant, dealing in hardware, reported that Theodore had purchased chains, padlocks, and various locks in unusual quantities. He always paid in cash, always collected the items personally, and never requested delivery to his property. When asked about their purpose, Theodore gave vague explanations, claiming he was making renovations and improving security around the farm. These details painted an even darker picture. The black fabric could have been used to line the locked rooms the wives had mentioned in letters. The chains and padlocks suggested possible confinement. Yet, all of this remained circumstantial, not definitive proof. Then, 3 weeks after the fire, something remarkable occurred. A hunter working deep in the forest, roughly 20 kilometers from Theodore's burned estate, discovered a small, abandoned cabin hidden in a remote valley rarely visited. Though the cabin was in ruins, there were signs of recent use. Inside, chains were affixed to the walls, and an old, stained mattress lay in the corner. Carved into the woodwork, faintly visible in the dim light, were names Sarah Margaret Elizabeth. The hunter hurried to report this to Sheriff Hutchkins, who immediately organized a team to investigate. What they found confirmed their worst fears. The cabin had clearly been used as a prison. The chains were strong enough to restrain someone, yet long enough to allow limited movement within the cramped space. Scattered remnants of old food, rusty cans, and a bucket that likely served as a toilet indicated prolonged occupancy. Most unsettling were the markings carved into the wood, in addition to the names. There were tally marks grouped in fives, counting the days, a system used by prisoners. Hundreds of marks suggested someone had been held for months. Fragmented words were partially legible: "Help, Mother, please, God." The discovery raised more questions than it answered. If the women had been held here, why had Theodore kept them alive instead of killing them? And, crucially, where were they now? The cabin appeared abandoned for at least a few weeks, possibly even before the fire. Intensive searches were carried out throughout the surrounding area. Sniffer dogs trained to locate human remains were brought in from another county and combed the woods for days, following trails that led to nothing, barking at areas where no evidence existed. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed all traces of what occurred. During these searches, one volunteer noticed additional markings. On a tree about 100 meters from the cabin were notches clearly made by human hands. They formed arrows pointing deeper into the forest toward the higher mountains. Someone had left a path, perhaps an escape route, or a guide to a specific destination. Investigators followed the arrows for miles, climbing increasingly steep terrain. The markers appeared sporadically, etched into trees and rocks. Whoever had made them knew the land well and was careful not to get lost. The trail eventually led to a narrow canyon with a stream flowing over smooth stones. There, the markers abruptly ended. No further signs pointed the way. The stream may have been used to erase footprints, a technique familiar to someone trying to avoid pursuit. Whether people had followed it uphill or downhill was impossible to determine. The search continued for another 2 weeks, yielding no results. The Appalachian mountains were vast, unforgiving, and riddled with caves, ravines, and impenetrable forests. If Theodore was familiar with the area, and evidence suggested he could have concealed anything, and it might have taken years to locate. Meanwhile, rumors spread through local communities. Some claimed to see a man matching Theodore's description in distant towns, always alone, disappearing before he could be approached. Others reported hearing women's screams in the night, possibly wind in the trees, or something far more sinister. Each tip was investigated, but none produced concrete results. Frustrated, Judge Blackwood took an unusual step. He offered a substantial reward, $500, a fortune at the time, for any information leading to Theodore Whitmore's capture or the discovery of the missing women. Posters offering the reward were circulated widely, not just in Virginia but also in neighboring states, stretching north to Pennsylvania and south to North Carolina. The announcement prompted a flood of reports, many false or fabricated by desperate claimants. However, a few contained details that drew investigators' attention. A river trader who transported goods along the Appalachian waterways reported ferrying a man and a woman matching the descriptions of Theodore and Catherine approximately 2 weeks before the fire. There were no obvious signs of trauma to the bones, no fractures, no marks that would indicate a violent struggle. The doctor, however, noted the position of the bodies and the context in which they were found. Buried hastily in shallow graves behind the ruined barn, the remains suggested concealment rather than a formal interment. Combined with the evidence from the cabin and Theodore's meticulous but sinister preparations, the conclusion was chilling. These women had likely been held captive for months and had died under circumstances that may not have left physical traces. Starvation, neglect, or exposure could have been enough. The discovery of the 3 bodies finally confirmed what the families had long feared but dared not fully accept. The graves behind the barn were a stark contrast to the elegant, false markers in the private cemetery. Where they had once believed their daughters lay peacefully, they now confronted the cruel reality that Theodore had not only deceived them, but had hidden the truth behind a carefully constructed lie. Sheriff Hutchins intensified the search for any remaining traces of Theodore and Catherine. If Theodore had taken Catherine with him, she might still be alive, though likely in a state of extreme trauma. Hutchins retraced the river traders' route, revisited Greystone and Millbrook, and coordinated with authorities in neighboring towns. Yet, despite these efforts, no one could confirm Catherine's whereabouts. The case became legendary throughout the Virginia mountains, whispered in every village and valley. People spoke of the missing wives, the burned mountain estate, the hidden cabin, and the fake graves. Theodore Whitmore, or the man who had assumed that name, vanished into history, leaving behind a trail of deception, suffering, and unanswered questions. For the families, closure came only in part. They could finally mourn properly at the newly discovered graves behind the barn, laying flowers and holding memorials for the daughters who had been cruelly taken from them. Yet the haunting questions remained. Where was Catherine? Had she escaped, or had she suffered the same fate as the others? And who was the man who had wreaked such havoc, assuming another's identity, marrying, deceiving, and terrorizing? In the years that followed, the burned estate became a place of dark legend. Travelers avoided the overgrown path, telling tales of eerie shadows among the ruins, ghostly lights, and the faint echo of a woman's cries carried on the mountain wind. The story of Theodore Whitmore, the mirrorless house, the hidden cabin, and the vanished wives became part of Appalachian folklore, a cautionary tale about charm, deceit, and the secrets that mountains can hold. And somewhere, perhaps Catherine Miller Whitmore, or at least the girl who had been forced into the nightmare, remained lost to time, her fate a final, unanswerable mystery in a story that had begun with mirrors, superstition, and the quiet, calculated cruelty of a man who was never truly who he claimed to be. When Sheriff Hutchins arrived in the small town, he found Catherine weak but coherent. She was surrounded by townspeople who had tended to her, offering warmth, food, and basic care. Her appearance was shocking, thin, pale, and visibly traumatized. But there was life in her eyes, a flicker of recognition and relief when she saw familiar faces from the county. Catherine recounted the months she had spent with Theodore. After the fire, he had moved them westward through remote valleys, changing their appearances, using false names, and constantly keeping her confined. The black cloth, chains, and locks described in previous investigations had been used to isolate her in hidden rooms of remote cabins, preventing her from escaping or signaling for help. Theodore had provided food and minimal care, enough to keep her alive but utterly dependent on him. Her words were calm, almost monotone, but the weight of what she endured was clear in her silence between phrases and the tremor in her hands. She explained that she had been kept mostly inside the cabins, hidden from view, and forced to follow Theodore's strict routines. Occasionally, he would take her outside during daylight, but only to travel to another hiding place. He never allowed her to see her own reflection, reinforcing a sense of disorientation and dependence. Catherine's memory of the other wives was fragmented. She remembered glimpses of Sarah, Margaret, and Elizabeth, but Theodore had moved so frequently and so carefully that she had never fully grasped the fate of the women. Only now, after being discovered, did the full horror of her situation begin to settle. Sheriff Hutchins and Martha Miller arranged immediate transport for Catherine back to her home county. Along the way, she spoke sparingly but with clarity about Theodore's movements, the hidden cabins, and the chains he had used. Her information allowed authorities to map potential locations where he might have hidden or fled. The news of Catherine's survival spread quickly, lifting the spirits of the families devastated by Theodore's crimes. Martha Miller wept openly upon seeing her daughter alive, the grief of months spent fearing the worst mingling with the overwhelming relief of reunion. Catherine, though alive, would need months, perhaps years, to recover physically and emotionally from the ordeal she had endured. Judge Blackwood, upon learning of Catherine's rescue, reissued the orders for Theodore's capture with renewed urgency. Using the detailed account from Catherine, local authorities coordinated with neighboring counties to track him down. It became clear that he would need to be found quickly, before he could disappear once again into the mountains or across state lines. The case of Theodore Whitmore, imposter, kidnapper, and orchestrator of a chain of horrors, would go down in history as one of the most chilling sagas of post-war Appalachia. And Catherine Miller Whitmore, though scarred by her experiences, had survived the impossible, her return offering a fragile but vital thread of hope amid the darkness he had left behind. First glimpse of hope. Theodore had grown careless. He had underestimated her will to survive. For the first time in months, Catherine realized that she could act without immediate detection. She observed the inn, noting the comings and goings of other guests, memorizing exits, and mentally mapping the streets beyond. One evening, as Theodore dozed after an exhausting day of travel, Catherine quietly gathered what little belongings she had, her clothes, a few personal items, and waited for the right moment. When the innkeeper went to check on them, she slipped out of the room, careful to make no sound, and fled into the night. She ran barefoot through back alleys, guided by moonlight and instinct, until she reached the main road. Her plan was simple: find help, anyone who could protect her from Theodore. It was in that state of utter desperation and exhaustion that she stumbled into the church in the town on the Virginia-Tennessee border. Collapsing in the aisle, she was met with warmth, food, and shelter for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Her mind was still clouded with fear and confusion, but she had escaped Theodore Whitmore. Sheriff Hutchins, upon hearing her account in full, realized that Theodore's disappearance was no longer just a flight from justice. He had lost his grip on his carefully constructed control. With Catherine alive and recounting every detail, authorities had the key to understanding his methods, his routes, and perhaps predicting where he might strike next. The case, however, was far from over. Theodore Whitmore remained at large, a dangerous man with intimate knowledge of the mountains and their hidden paths. But Catherine's survival, her courage, and the painstaking work of her family and the sheriff had turned the tide. The long hunt for justice had a new direction, and for the first time in months, there was hope that the nightmare could finally end. Theodore had drunk more than usual, trying to calm his nerves. When he finally fell asleep soundly, Catherine waited to be certain. Then, hands shaking with fear and adrenaline, she grabbed what little money she could find in his pockets, put on shoes far too large for her feet, and slipped quietly out the ground floor window. Her escape marked the beginning of a harrowing week-long journey. Distrustful of local authorities and fearing Theodore's threats, she traveled hidden in wagons, walked back roads by night, and ate whatever she could beg or find. Disoriented and exhausted, she wandered south instead of north, finally collapsing in a church in Tennessee. Months after her nightmare began, Catherine was finally safe, surrounded by people who believed her and wanted to help. Her testimony revealed critical information: the secret attic room, the black cloth-lined prison, and the other wives' belongings preserved like macabre trophies. She described the cruel control Theodore had exercised, the glimpses of the other women's fates, and the psychological torment that had defined her captivity. Armed with her testimony, authorities issued new warrants for Theodore, now wanted not just for fraud and kidnapping, but for 3 murders. The reward increased to $1,000 and drew bounty hunters from multiple states. Yet Theodore, or James Harlow, or whichever identity he assumed, vanished completely. Sightings occurred over the next years, from Missouri to South Carolina, but he always eluded capture. Catherine slowly rebuilt her life. She never remarried, carrying the deep scars of her ordeal. Yet she dedicated herself to helping other women, using her story to warn of the dangers of control and manipulation. The families of Sarah, Margaret, and Elizabeth finally buried their daughters with dignity. The false graves on the mountain property were dismantled, replaced with honest markers in the churchyard, while the burned estate remained abandoned, slowly reclaimed by the Appalachian wilderness. Travelers spoke of it in hushed tones. The house of 6 brides, though there had been only 4. Decades passed. The case faded from public attention, yet Catherine lived to a ripe old age, passing in 1923, carrying memories too heavy to fully share. Theodore was never captured, never faced justice, and his true identity remains a mystery. The mirrors removed from the house remain one of the most enigmatic symbols, a reflection of his desire to control not just bodies, but identities and reality itself. The stone foundations of the estate remain, circles of blackened stones barely visible beneath decades of fallen leaves. The place is silent now, broken only by the wind in the trees, a monument to interrupted lives and hidden secrets. Stories like this remind us of life's fragility, the importance of vigilance, and how communities can unite in the search for truth and justice, even when the path is long and painful. If this tale touched you, share your thoughts. Subscribe to uncover more stories from history's darkest corners, because sometimes truth is far more disturbing than fiction.